Lecture 25, Tourism and the Leisured Class. The first American expedition into the Grand Canyon was led by John Wesley Powell in 1869. By 1893, the Grand Canyon was set aside as a federally protected area, but it didn't receive national park status until 1919. And by that time, the Grand Canyon had a significant tourist infrastructure built by the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company. Class issues were integral in the development of the Grand Canyon's tourist infrastructure. The Grand Canyon was constructed and marketed to a leisured class of Americans, so the desires and fantasies of this class integrally shaped the physical and conceptual development of the site itself. Early tourists to the Grand Canyon were members of the social elite who had time and money to invest in a rejuvenating Western adventure. The Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company advertisers identified their target audience and adeptly created media products like pamphlets and brochures that offered this audience an imagined tourist world of rustic felicity. Promotional materials, many of which have aesthetic value and can be categorized as material arts and are sometimes referred to as graphic arts, focused on constructing the Grand Canyon as an all-inclusive destination: luxury, relaxation, rejuvenation, and adventure. They piggybacked on current aesthetic and philosophical trends, including the appreciation of and desire for wild nature, as well as the new desire for a pioneer experience that came out of the Western aesthetic, and Theodore Roosevelt's call for fitness, which we'll talk about in a moment. By the latter 19th century, American attitudes towards wild nature had been significantly influenced by Romanticism, with most indigenous peoples either dead or confined to reservations by the 1890s, and the continent spanned. Wild nature was no longer an adversary, and the pioneer life was now a thing of the past. Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian at the time, studied the relationship between American social progress and the frontier, and he announced in an 1893 public address that the frontier was closed, gone, done, which would seem like an accomplishment, something to celebrate. But Turner also linked the success of the nation and the strength and fortitude of the American character to the continued practice of forging across the continent and engaging the frontier. It was the meeting point between savagery and civilization. If the frontier experience was critical to the formation and success of America and American democracy, what makes us American and differentiates us from Europe, then what happens when there is no more frontier? This notion threw American society, especially social leaders and the elite, into a tizzy. Combine this identity crisis with the massive immigration and social unrest that marks the turn of the century, and you have the foundations for Theodore Roosevelt's claim that the strenuous life, returning to nature to practice primitive skills, rejuvenate the mind, and strengthen the body, would save the nation. Roosevelt gave a speech, what amounts to a campaign speech as he was president from 1901 to 1909. He gave this speech in 1899 addressing this issue. Drawing from romantic notions of nature as restorative and recreative, and the primitivist's noble savage character, Roosevelt demanded that the American citizenry, who had been made soft, slothful, and timid by over-civilization, because remember, the US was now predominantly industrial and the population concentrated in urban centers on the East Coast, that these slothful and timid citizens endeavor to engage in exploration and adventure. Roosevelt positions this directive as not only integral to the survival of individuals, but also to the survival of the nation. Quote, "If we stand idly by, if we seek merely swollen, slothful ease and ignoble peace, if we shrink from the hard contests where men must win at hazard of their lives and at the risk of all they hold dear, then the bolder and stronger peoples will pass us by and will win for themselves the domination of the world." End quote. He is specifically addressing the wealthy members of society. Quote, "If you are rich and worth your salt, you will teach your sons that, though they may have leisure, it is not to be spent in idleness. For wisely used leisure merely means that those who possess it, being free from the necessity of working for their livelihood, are all the more bound to carry on some kind of non remunerative work in science, in letters, in art, in exploration, in historical research. Work of the type we most need in this country, the successful carrying out of which reflects most honor upon the nation." End quote. Roosevelt's shaming of the elite can also be attributed to the glaring class disparity of this era and the increasing tensions between the working classes and the social elite. His proverbial call to arms inspired works of literature, including Jack London's famed novel, which I know the majority of you are familiar with, The Call of the Wild, which he wrote in 1903, and Edgar Rice Burroughs' enduring story of a boy who grows up in the jungle and becomes the world's first superhero, Tarzan of the Apes, which he published in 1914. London's novel, The Call of the Wild, is included today as part of our literary canon, works that have been categorized by certain authorities as the best that has been thought and said. Why do you think this might be? Well, London's tale positions a domesticated dog as a hero. This dog, Buck, is stolen from his human oppressor and makes his way into the wilds of the Alaskan Yukon. Along his journey, this hero discovers that not only does he not need the soft, effeminate luxuries of the civilized world, but indeed he is rejuvenated without them. He finds his primordial power and is embraced as the leader of a wild pack of wolves, his nature and his ultimate desires anchored in the wildness of the last frontier. Clearly, Buck functions as a metaphor for the tamed and constrained potential and desires of the overly civilized male to whom Roosevelt directs his charge. While the majority of men didn't have the option of leaving civilization and returning to the wild, like purported nature man Joseph Knowles, who supposedly walked into the Maine woods naked in August 1913 and lived off the land for 2 months, most men, if they had the means, they could pretend pioneer in Yellowstone or Grand Canyon. So, there were also souvenirs that were available for purchase at the Grand Canyon. In addition to these promotional materials, in addition to the various kinds of aesthetically significant cultural products that encouraged men specifically to visit the Grand Canyon and the Wild West, there were also now available souvenirs that offered another avenue by which tourists could vicariously participate in the primitive. The Fred Harvey Company hired indigenous peoples to perform for tourists and to construct quote unquote authentic Indian objects that tourists could then purchase and take home, taking home a little bit of the primitive they so desperately desired to encounter. In our next lecture, we will discuss Hopi Tiwa artist Numpeo and the jars and bowls she created as souvenirs for the Fred Harvey Company.